Indian Economy by Ramesh Singh. Chapter 7. Inflation and Business Cycle. Fluctuations in the level of economic activity, alternating between periods of depression and boom, led by one prominent factor, i.e., the expectations of the future demand, intertwined with the inflation, has always been a fascinating topic for economists. Introduction. For a layman, inflation is just price rise. It becomes a matter of everyday discussion if the prices of daily or weekly items start rising. Whatever impact it might be having on other areas of economy, inflation might take an ugly turn and lead to a political crisis, at least in the developing economies. India has seen governments thrown out of power in elections due to price rise in daily use items. This is not the case in the developed economies, but inflation takes its political toll there too. In the developed economies, more aware and informed voters get carried away by the greater impact of higher or lower inflations in the elections. In this chapter, we will try to examine the concept of inflation from all possible dimensions to have an overall understanding. Definition. A rise in the general level of prices, a sustained rise in the general level of prices, persistent increases in the general level of prices, an increase in the general level of prices in an economy that is sustained over time, rising prices across the board, is inflation. These are some of the most common academic definitions of inflation. If the price of one good has gone up, it is not inflation. It is inflation only if the prices of most goods have gone up. Two terms are used to show a fall in general level of prices, disinflation and deflation. But these terms have very specific meanings in terms of price fall, while disinflation is considered good for the economy, as it brings comfort to the consumers. Deflation is not considered good, as it invites the risks of slowdown and even recession in the economy. In practice, the same term inflation is used by the experts to show price rise, i.e., inflation has gone up, as well as price fall, i.e., inflation has come down. The rate of inflation is measured on the basis of price indices, which are of two kinds: Wholesale Price Index, WPI, and Consumer Price Index, CPI. A price index is a measure of the average level of prices, which means that it does not show the exact price rise or fall of a single good. The rate of inflation is the rate of change of general price level, which is measured as follows. Rate of inflation, year kiss smiley is equal to price level, year kiss smiley, price level, year x minus 1, divided by price level, year x minus 1, times 100. This rate shows up in percentage form, percentage, though inflation is also shown in numbers, i.e., digits. A price index is a weighted average of the prices of a number of goods and services. In the index, the total weight is taken as 100 at a particular year of the past, the base year. This, when compared to the current year, shows a rise or fall in the prices of current year. There is a rise or fall in the 100 in comparison to the base year, and this inflation is measured in digits. Inflation is measured point to point. It means that the reference dates for the annual inflation is 1st January to 1st January of two consecutive years, not for 1st January to 31st December of the concerned year. Similarly, the weekly rate of inflation is the change in 1 week, reference being the two consecutive last days of the week, i.e., 5 p.m. of two Fridays in India. Why does inflation occur? Economists have been giving different explanations throughout the 19th and 20th centuries for the occurrence of inflation. The debate still goes on. But the debate has certainly given us a clearer picture of inflation. We shall see the reasons responsible for inflation in two parts. 1. Pre-1970s. Till the rise of the monetarist school, economists used to agree upon two reasons behind inflation. 1. Demand pull inflation, a mismatch between demand and supply pulls up prices. Either the demand increases over the same level of supply, or the supply decreases with the same level of demand, and thus the situation of demand pull inflation arises. This was a Keynesian idea. The Keynesian school suggests cuts in spending as the way of tackling excess demand, mainly by increasing taxes and reducing government expenditure. In practice, the governments keep tracking the demand-supply matrix to check such inflation. Depending upon the situation, the goods in short supply are imported, interest on loans increased, and wages revised. 2. Cost push inflation, an increase in factor input costs, i.e., wages and raw materials, pushes up prices. The price rise, which is the result of increase in the production cost, is cost push inflation. The Keynesian school suggested controls on prices and incomes as direct ways of checking such an inflation, and moral suasions and measures to reduce the monopoly power of trade unions as indirect measures. Basically, cost push inflations chiefly used to happen due to higher wage demanded by the trade unions during the era. Today, the governments of the world use many tools to check such inflations, reducing excise and custom duties on raw materials, wage revisions, etc. to post-1970s. After the rise of monetaristic school of economics in the early 1970s, monetarism developed in opposition to post-1945 Keynesian idea of demand management. The school provided monetarist explanation for inflation, the so-called demand pull or the cost push, which is excessive creation of money in the economy. 1. Demand pull inflation for the monetarists. A demand pull inflation is creation of extra purchasing power to the consumer over the same level of production, which happens due to wage revisions at the micro level and deficit financing at the macro level. This is the typical case of creating extra money, either by printing or public borrowing, without equivalent creation in production or supply, i.e., too much money chasing too little output, the ultimate source of demand pull inflation. 2. Cost push inflation. Similarly, for the monetarists, cost push is not a truly independent theory of inflation. It has to be financed by some extra money, which is created by the government via wage revision, public borrowing, printing of currency, etc. A price rise does not get automatically reciprocated by consumers purchasing. Basically, people must have got some extra purchasing power created, that's why they start purchasing at higher prices also. If this has not been the reason, people would have cut down their consumption, i.e., overall demand, to the level of their purchasing capacity, and the aggregate demand of goods would have gone down. But this does not happen. It means every cost push inflation is a result of excessive creation of money, increasing money flow or money supply. For the monetarists, a particular level of money supply for a particular level of production is healthy for an economy. Extra creation of money over the same level of production causes inflation. They suggested proper monetary policy, money supply, interest rates, printing of currencies, public borrowing, etc., to check situations of inflationary pressure on the economy. Monetarists rejected the Keynesian theory of inflation. 3. Measures to check inflation. Inflation being a socio-economically sensitive issue, governments across the world try several short and long-term policy steps to check it from getting uncomfortable. A brief idea about the steps are given below. 1. Demand-side measure. In this category mainly, two types of steps are taken. Firstly, the consumers are appealed to cut back the consumption of the items which show higher inflation, called austerity. This step has generally failed across the world because it does not work in case of essential items such as wheat, rice, milk, tea, etc. And as people who have money, they don't wish to cut down consumption. Secondly, the government may tighten flow of money in the system, known as monetary measure. Central bank making money costlier by increasing repo rate, increasing CRR, etc. in case of India. This step also has its own limitations. It is not effective if the items showing inflation are essential ones, such as wheat, rice, onion, potato, etc., because consumers don't borrow money from banks to buy them. But it can be quite effective if the items are building materials. Interest on home loan can be increased to cut back the demand of these items. 2. Supply side measure. Aimed at increasing the supply of the items showing inflation, the government may go in for upscaling the production or import of the items. This measure also has its own limitations. Production may not be upscaled in short run and import may not reach the country in time. Rather, in medium and long run, production of these items can be upscaled. 3. Cost side measure. Two variety of steps may be taken under it. In short run, cutting taxes can bring in comfort, but in the long run, cutting cost of production is the only way out by scaling up technology. Types of inflation. Depending upon the range of increase and its severity, inflation may be classified into three broad categories. 1. Low inflation. Such inflation is slow and on predictable lines, which might be called small or gradual. This is a comparative term which puts it opposite to the faster, bigger, and unpredictable inflations. Low inflation takes place in a longer period, and the range of increase is usually in single digit. Such inflation has also been called as creeping inflation. We may take an example of the monthly inflation rate of a country for 6 months being 2.3%, 2.6%, 2.7%, 2.9%, 3.1%, and 3.4%. Here the range of change is of 1.1% and over a period of 6 months. 2. Galloping inflation. This is a very high inflation running in the range of double-digit or triple-digit, i.e., 20%, 100% or 200% in a year. In the decades of 1970s and 1980s, many Latin American countries such as Argentina, Chile, and Brazil had such rates of inflation in the range of 50 to 700%. The Russian economy did show such inflation after the disintegration of the ex-USSR in the late 1980s. Contemporary journalism has given some other names to this inflation: hopping inflation, jumping inflation, and running or runaway inflation. 3. Hyperinflation. This form of inflation is large and accelerating, which might have the annual rates in million or even trillion. In such inflation, not only the range of increase is very large, but the increase takes place in a very short span of time. Prices shoot up overnight. The best example of hyperinflation that economists cite is of Germany after the First World War in early 1920s. At the end of 1923, prices were 36 billion times higher than 2 years earlier. This inflation was so severe that paper German currencies, the Deutschmark, were more valuable as stove fuel than as actual money. Some recent examples of hyperinflation had been the Bolivian inflation of mid-1985, 24,000% per annum, and the Yugoslavian inflation of 1993, 20% per day. The latest example has been Venezuela, which saw an annual inflation of over 53 million% by 2019, as per its central bank. The currency of Zimbabwe was declared worthless by the magazine The Economist, in wake of rise in annual inflation to 90 billion trillion% by 2008. Such an inflation quickly leads to a complete loss of confidence in the domestic currency, and people start opting for other forms of money, as for example physical assets, gold and foreign currency, also known as inflation-proof assets, and people might switch to barter exchange. Other variants of inflation. Other than the three broad categories we analyzed above, some other variants of inflation are also considered by governments in their policy making. 1. Bottleneck inflation. This inflation takes place when the supply falls drastically and the demand remains at the same level. Such situations arise due to supply-side hurdles, hazards or mismanagement, which is also known as structural inflation. This could be put in the demand pull inflation category. 2. Core inflation. This nomenclature is based on the inclusion or exclusion of the goods and services while calculating inflation. Popular in Western economies, core inflation shows price rise in all goods and services excluding energy and food articles. First used in India in 2001, it does not suit our inflation analysis in the right sense because prices here depend more on food articles and energy. Since 2015 to 16, a new core inflation is also measured by India, which excludes food, fuel and light, transport and communication. Other important terms. Inflationary gap. The excess of total government spending above the national income, i.e., fiscal deficit, is known as inflationary gap. This is intended to increase the production level, which ultimately pushes the prices up due to extra creation of money during the process. Deflationary gap. The shortfall in total spending of the government, i.e., fiscal surplus, over the national income creates deflationary gaps in the economy. This is a situation of producing more than the demand, and the economy usually heads for a general slowdown in the level of demand. This is also known as the output gap. Inflation tax. Inflation erodes the value of money, and the people who hold currency suffer in this process. As the governments have authority of printing currency and circulating it into the economy, as they do in the case of deficit financing, this act functions as an income to the governments. This is a situation of sustaining government expenditure at the cost of people's income. This looks as if inflation is working as a tax. That is how the term inflation tax is also known as seigniorage. It means inflation is always the level to which the government may go for deficit financing. Level of deficit financing is directly reflected by the rate of inflation. It could also be used by the governments in the form of prices and incomes policy under which the companies pay inflation tax on the salary increases above the set level prescribed by the government. Inflation spiral. An inflationary situation in an economy which results out of a process of wage and price interaction when wages press prices up and prices pull wages up is known as the inflationary spiral. It is also known as the wage price spiral. This wage price interaction was seen as a plausible cause of inflation in the year 1935 in the US economy for the first time. Inflation accounting. A term popular in the area of corporate profit accounting. Basically, due to inflation, the profit of firms or companies gets overstated. When a firm calculates its profits after adjusting the effects of current level of inflation, this process is known as inflation accounting. Such profits are the real profit of the firm, which could be compared to a historic rate of inflation of the base year, True. Inflation premium. The bonus brought by inflation to the borrowers is known as the inflation premium. The interest banks charge on their lending is known as the nominal interest rate, which might not be the real cost of borrowing paid by the borrower to the banks. To calculate the real cost a borrower is paying on its loan, the nominal rate of interest is adjusted with the effect of inflation, and thus the interest rate we get is known as the real interest rate. Real interest is always lower than the nominal interest rate. If the inflation is taking place, the difference is the inflation premium. Rising inflation premium shows depleting profits of the lending institutions. At times, to neutralize the effects of inflation premium, the lender takes the recourse to increase the nominal rate of interest. In recent times, it was done by the Indian banks in July 2003 to ward off their depleting profits when inflation had crossed the 7% level. The level of inflation was threatening to deplete even the capital base of the banks. Since then, the RBI has been following a tighter credit policy, as inflation was going beyond the upper limit of its healthy range, i.e., 4 to 5% in the Indian case. Phillips curve. It is a graphic curve which advocates a relationship between inflation and unemployment in an economy. As per the curve, there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, i.e., an inverse relationship between them. The curve suggests that lower the inflation, higher the unemployment, and higher the inflation, lower the unemployment. During the 1960s, this idea was among the most important theories of the modern economists. This concept is known after the economists who developed it, Alban William Housego Phillips, 1914 to 75. Bill Phillips, popular name, was an electrical engineer from New Zealand and was an economist at the London School of Economics when propounded the idea. In the relation between unemployment and the rate of change of money wage rates in the United Kingdom, 1861 to 1957, published in Economica in 1958, he provided empirical evidence to support his ideas. By the early 1960s, an economic wisdom emerged around the world that by following a certain kind of monetary policy, unemployment could be checked forever, and at the cost of a slightly higher inflation, unemployment could be reduced permanently. The central banks of the developed world started framing the required kind of monetary policies, mixing the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. The idea became popular among the developing economies too by the late 1960s, though they were a bit confused, as most of them were fighting the menace of higher inflations, double-digit, along with high level of unemployment. By the early 1970s, to American economists, Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate, 1976, and Edmund Phelps challenged the idea of the Phillips curve. According to them, the trade-off between inflation and unemployment was only short-term, because once people came to expect higher inflation, they started demanding higher wages, and thus unemployment will rise back to its natural rate, the unemployment rate that occurs at full employment when the economy is producing at potential output. It is usually called the natural rate of unemployment. They advocated that there was no long-term trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In the long run, monetary policy can influence inflation. They suggested that if monetary policy tried to hold unemployment below its natural rate, inflation will be rising to higher level, which is also known as the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, NIRU. The NIRU is that rate of unemployment which is consistent with a constant rate of inflation. It means at NIRU, the upward and downward forces on price, inflation, and wage, unemployment, neutralize each other, and there is no tendency of change in the rate of inflation. We may say that the NAIRU is the lowest unemployment rate that an economy can sustain without any upward pressure on inflation rate. Reflation. Reflation is a situation often deliberately brought by the government to reduce unemployment and increase demand by going for higher levels of economic growth. Governments go for higher public expenditures, tax cuts, interest rate cuts, etc. Fiscal deficit rises, extra money is generally printed at higher level of growth, wages increase, and there is almost no improvement in unemployment. Reflation can also be understood from a different angle. When the economy is crossing through the cycle of recession, low inflation, high unemployment, low demand, etc., and government takes some economic policy decisions to revive the economy from recession, certain goods see sudden and temporary increase in their prices. Such price rise is also known as reflation. Stagflation. Stagflation is a situation in an economy when inflation and unemployment both are at higher levels, contrary to conventional belief. Such a situation first arose in the 1970s in the US economy, average unemployment rate above 6% and the average rate of inflation above 7%, and in many Euro-American economies. This took place as a result of oil price increases of 1973 and 1979 and anticipation of higher inflation. The stagflationary situation continued till the early 1980s. Conventional thinking that a trade-off existed between inflation and unemployment, i.e., Phillips curve, was falsified and several economies switched over to alternative ways of economic policies, such as monetaristic and supply-side economics. When the economy is passing through the cycle of stagnation, i.e., long period of low aggregate demand in relation to its productive capacity, and the government shuffles with the economic policy, a sudden and temporary price rise is seen in some of the goods. Such inflation is also known as stagflation. Stagflation is basically a combination of high inflation and high growth. Inflation targeting. The announcement of an official target range for inflation is known as inflation targeting. It is done by the central bank in an economy as a part of their monetary policy to realize the objective of a stable rate of inflation. The Government of India asked the RBI to perform this function in the early 1970s. India commenced inflation targeting formally in February 2015 when an agreement between the GOI and the RBI was signed related to it, the Agreement on Monetary Policy Framework. The agreement provides the aim of inflation targeting in this way. It is essential to have a modern monetary framework to meet the challenge of an increasingly complex economy. Whereas the objective of monetary policy is to primarily maintain price stability, while keeping in mind the objective of growth. The highlights of the agreement is as given below. The RBI will aim to bring CPIC inflation below 6% by January 2016. The target for financial year 2016-17 and all subsequent years shall be 4% with a band of plus or 2%. It means the healthy range of inflation to be 2 to 6%. RBI to publish the operating targets and establish an operating procedure of monetary policy to achieve the target. Any change in the operating targets and operating procedure in response to evolving macrofinancial conditions shall also be published. Every 6 months, the RBI to publish a document explaining 1. Source of inflation, 2. Forecasts of inflation for the period between 6 to 18 months from the date of the publication of the document, and the RBI shall be seen to have failed to meet the target if inflation is 1. More than 6% for 3 consecutive quarters for the financial year 2015-16 and all subsequent years. 2. Less than 2% for 3 consecutive quarters in 2016-17 and all subsequent years. If the RBI fails to meet the target, it shall set out in a report to the GOI 1. The reasons for its failure to achieve the target under set in this agreement. 2. Remedial actions proposed to be taken by the RBI. And 3. An estimate of the time period within which the target would be achieved pursuant to timely implementation of proposed remedial actions. Any dispute regarding the interpretation or implementation of the agreement to be resolved between the Governor, RBI and the GOI. It should be noted that the Urjit Patel Committee set up by the RBI on monetary policy gave similar advices by early 2014. The move is seen as a follow-up to this. This way, India joined the club of inflation-targeting countries such as USA, UK, European Union, Japan, South Korea, China, Indonesia and Brazil. It was New Zealand which went for inflation targeting in 1989 for the first time in the world. Skewflation. Economists usually distinguish between inflation and a relative price increase. Inflation refers to a sustained, across-the-board price increase, whereas a relative price increase is a reference to an episodic price rise pertaining to one or a small group of commodities. This leaves a third phenomenon, namely one in which there is a price rise of one or a small group of commodities over a sustained period of time, without a traditional designation. Skewflation is a relatively new term to describe this third category of price rise. In India, food prices rose steadily during the last months of 2009 and the early months of 2010, even though the prices of non-food items continued to be relatively stable. As this somewhat unusual phenomenon stubbornly persisted, policymakers conferred on how to bring it to an end. The term skewflation made an appearance in internal documents of the Government of India and then appeared in print in the Economic Survey 2009-10 GOI, MOEF. The skewedness of inflation in India in the early months of 2010 was obvious from the fact that food price inflation crossed the 20% mark in multiple months, whereas wholesale price index, WPI, inflation never once crossed 11%. It may be pointed out that the skewflation has gradually given way to a lower-grade generalized inflation, with the economy in the middle of 2011 inflating at around 9% with food and non-food price increases roughly at the same level. Given that other nations have faced similar problems, the use of this term picked up quickly, with The Economist magazine, 24th January 2011, in an article entitled Price Rises in China, Inflated Fears, wondering if China was beginning to suffer from an Indian-style skewflation. GDP deflator. This is the ratio of the GDP at current prices to that of the constant prices. It is derived by using the following formula. GDP deflator is equal to GDP at current prices divided by GDP at constant prices 100 yen. This shows the increase in the value of GDP due to increase in inflation in between the period, base year, i.e., the year of constant prices, and the current year. This is why it is used as a measure of inflation, also known as implicit price deflator. Though countries use inflation indices to measure inflation, these indices are not able to capture all goods and services produced by them. In case of India, while services are not included in the Wholesale Price Index, WPI, the Consumer Price Index, CPI, contains only those goods and services which households purchase for consumption, such as food, cloth, health, education, etc., and misses several other goods and services, such as intermediate goods, services required by firms, etc. Since the deflator covers the entire range of goods and services produced in the economy, it is seen as a more comprehensive measure of inflation. Base effect. It refers to the impact of the rise in price level, i.e., last year's inflation, in the previous year over the corresponding rise in price levels in the current year, i.e., current inflation. If the price index had risen at a high rate in the corresponding period of the previous year, leading to a high inflation rate, some of the potential rise is already factored in. Therefore, a similar absolute increase in the price index in the current year will lead to a relatively lower inflation rates. On the other hand, if the inflation rate was too low in the corresponding period of the previous year, even a relatively smaller rise in the price index will arithmetically give a high rate of current inflation. For example, the index has increased by 20 points in all the 3 years, with 2008, 2009, and 2010. However, the inflation rate, calculated on year-on-year basis, tends to decline over the 3 years from 20% in 2008 to 14.9% in 2010. This is because the absolute increase of 20 points in the price index in each year increases the base year price index by an equivalent amount, while the absolute increase in price index remains the same. The year-on-year inflation is calculated by the formula. Current inflation rate is equal to current price index, last year's price index, 100 yen. Effects of inflation. There are multidimensional effects of inflation on an economy both at the micro and macro levels. It redistributes income, distorts relative prices, destabilizes employment, tax, saving and investment policies, and finally it may bring in recession and depression in an economy. A brief and objective overview of the effects of inflation is given below. 1. On creditors and debtors. Inflation redistributes wealth from creditors to debtors, i.e., lenders suffer and borrowers benefit out of inflation. The opposite effect takes place when inflation falls, i.e., deflation. 2. On lending. With the rise in inflation, lending institutions feel the pressure of higher lending. Institutions don't revise the nominal rate of interest as the real cost of borrowing, i.e., nominal rate of interest minus inflation, falls by the same percentage with which inflation rises. 3. On aggregate demand. Rising inflation indicates rising aggregate demand and indicates comparatively lower supply and higher purchasing capacity among the consumers. Usually, higher inflation suggests the producers to increase their production level, as it is generally considered as an indication of higher demand in the economy. 4. On investment. Investment in the economy is boosted by the inflation in the short run because of 2 reasons. 1. Higher inflation indicates higher demand and suggests entrepreneurs to expand their production level. And 2. Higher the inflation, lower the cost of loan, as shown above in number 2. 5. On income. Inflation affects the income of individual and firms alike. An increase in inflation increases the nominal value of income, while the real value of income remains the same. Increased price levels erode the purchasing power of the money in the short run, but in the long run the income levels also increase, making the nominal value of income going upward. It means, in a given period of time income may go up due to 2 reasons, viz. Inflationary situation and increased earning. The concept GDP deflator, GDP at current prices divided by GDP at constant prices, gives the idea of inflation effect on income over a given period. 6. On saving. Holding money does not remain an intelligent economic decision because money loses value with every increase in inflation. That is why people visit banks more frequently and try to hold least money with themselves and put maximum with the banks in their saving accounts, to minimize the loss in value of money with interest earned on it, provided bank is paying positive interest on saving account. This is also known as the should-leather cost of inflation, as it consumes the precious time of the people visiting the bank, frequently tagging their shoe. It means that saving rate increases. But this happens as a short-term effect of inflation. In the long run, higher inflation depletes the saving rate in an economy. Just the opposite situation arises when inflation falls or shows falling traits with decreasing saving in the short run and increasing saving in the long run, respectively. 7. On expenditure, inflation affects both the forms of expenditures, consumption as well as investment. Increased prices make our consumption levels fall as goods and services we buy get costlier. We see a tendency among the people to cut their consumption levels aimed at neutralizing the impact of price rise, making consumption expenditure fall. Exact opposite happens once prices head downward. On the other hand, inflation makes investment expenditure increase as a result of decreased cost of money or finance. Inflation brings benefit to borrower, known as inflation premium. In times of price fall, just opposite happens. 8. On tax structure of the economy, inflation creates two distortions. 1. Taxpayers suffer while paying their direct and indirect taxes. As indirect taxes are imposed ad valorem, on value, increased prices of goods make taxpayers to pay increased indirect taxes like Senvat, VAT, etc. in India. Similarly, due to inflation, direct tax, income tax, interest tax, etc. burden of the taxpayers also increases as taxpayers' gross income moves to the upward slabs of official tax brackets. But the real value of money does not increase due to inflation. In fact, it falls. This problem is also known as bracket creep, i.e., inflation-induced tax increases. Some economies, as in the US and many European countries, have indexed their tax provisions to neutralize this distortion on the direct taxpayers. 2. The extent to which tax collections of the government are concerned, inflation increases the nominal value of the gross tax revenue, while real value of the tax collection does not compare with the current pace of inflation, as there is a lag, delay, in the tax collection in all economies. But governments get an advantage on their interest burden on their borrowings as inflation benefits borrowers. This benefit, however, depends upon the contemporary levels of fiscal deficit and the total national debt. In the case of a government incurring high fiscal deficit, increased borrowing, printing currency, inflation functions as a tax, i.e., inflation tax via which the government fulfills its expenditure by cutting down the expenditure and consumption of the people. 9. On exchange rate, with every inflation the currency of the economy depreciates, loses its exchange value in front of a foreign currency, provided it follows the flexible currency regime. Though it is a comparative matter, there might be inflationary pressure on the foreign currency against which the exchange rate is compared. 10. On export. With inflation, exportable items of an economy gain competitive prices in the world market. Due to this, the volume of export increases. Keep in mind that the value of export decreases here, and thus export income increases in the economy. It means export segment of the economy benefits due to inflation. Importing partners of the economy exert pressure for a stable exchange rate as their imports start increasing and exports start decreasing. See the next point. 11. On import, inflation gives an economy the advantage of lower imports and import substitution as foreign goods become costlier. But in the case of compulsory imports, i.e., oil, technology, drugs, etc., the economy does not get this benefit and loses more foreign currency instead of saving it. 12. On trade balance, in the case of a developed economy, inflation makes trade balance favorable, while for the developing economies inflation is unfavorable for their balance of trade. This is because of composition of their foreign trade. The benefit to export which inflation brings into a developing economy is usually lower than the loss it incurs due to its compulsory imports which become costlier due to inflation. 13. Unemployment inflation increases employment in the short run, but becomes neutral or even negative in the long run. See the Phillips curve and the Nairu in the earlier sections. 14. On wages. Inflation increases the nominal, face, value of wages, while their real value falls. That is why there is a negative impact of inflation on the purchasing power and living standard of wage employees. To neutralize this negative impact, the Indian government provides dearness allowance to its employees twice a year. 15. On the self-employed inflation has a neutralizing impact on the self-employed people in the long run. But in the short run they also get affected as the economy as a whole gets affected. 16. On the economy, all the segments discussed above belong to an economy, but we must know the overall short-term and long-term impacts of inflation on an economy. Experiences of the world economies in the late 1980s show that a particular level of inflation is healthy for an economy. This specific level of inflation was called as the range of inflation, and every economy needs to calculate its own range. Inflation beyond both the limits of the range is never healthy for any economy. In the case of India, it is considered to 6% at CPI-C, which is also known as the comfort zone of inflation in India since 2015. Similarly for Australia, New Zealand, the USA, Canada, and the European Union, the healthy range today is 1 to 3%. This is why every economy today utilizes inflation targeting as part of its monetary policy. Inflation beyond the limits of the decided or prescribed range brings in recession to depression. We will see them in section B of this chapter, under business cycle. Inflation in India. Every economy calculates its inflation for efficient financial administration, as the multidimensional effects of inflation make it necessary. India calculates its inflation onto price indices, i.e., the Wholesale Price Index, WPI, and the Consumer Price Index, CPI. While the WPI inflation is used at the macro-level policy making, the CPI inflation is used for micro-level analysis. The inflation at the WPI is the inflation of the economy. Both the indices follow the point-to-point method and may be shown in points, i.e., digit, as well as in percentage relative to a particular base year. Wholesale Price Index. The first index number of wholesale prices commenced in India for the week 10th January 1942. It was having the base week ending 19th August 1939 is equal to 100, which was published by the Office of the Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Ministry of Industry. Independent India followed the same series, with more number of commodities included in the index. Several changes regarding inclusion of commodities, assigning them the logical weights took place in the coming times, including revisions in the base years for the WPI. The WPI base year has been revised 5 times till date. The base years are as given below: 1. 1952 to 53 base year, 112 commodities, issued from June 1952. 2. 1961 to 62 base year, 139 commodities, issued from July 1969. 3. 1970 to 71 base year, 360 commodities, issued from January 1977. 4. 1981 to 82 base year, 447 commodities, issued. D. Quotations from 54.82 to 83.31. An increase by 28.49 quotations, 52%. The prices used for compilation do not include indirect taxes in order to remove impact of fiscal policy. This is in consonance with international practices and will make the new WPI conceptually closer to Producer Price Index, PPI. Item-level aggregates for new WPI have been compiled using geometric mean, GM, following international best practice, and as is currently used for compilation of the CPIC, the major changes in weights, number of items, and quotations between WPI 2004-05 and WPI 2011-12 are given in the Table 7.1. A new Wholesale Food Price Index, WPFI, has been introduced, combining the food articles belonging to the group primary articles and food products belonging to the group manufactured products. Together with the Consumer Food Price Index, CPFI, released by Central Statistics Office, this would help monitor the price situation of food items better. To keep pace with the changing structure of the economy, it is necessary to follow a dynamic review process of the WPI and related aspects it. That is why the government has set up, for the first time, a high-level technical review committee, TRC, for this purpose. The committee is headed by the Secretary, Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, DIP. Table 7.1. Meanwhile, a working group, headed by Ramesh Chand, member Niti Aayog, was set up by the government in mid-2019 to look into various issues related to the WPI, such as revising the current series of 2011 to 2012 to a new base year, reviewing its commodity basket, reviewing the existing system of price collection in particular for manufacturing sector and suggest changes for improvement, and suggesting a roadmap to switch over to PPI from the existing WPI. Consumer Price Index. India has been measuring inflation at the consumer prices also besides at the wholesale prices. But in place of a single consumer price index, CPI, India was managing with four differing set of the CPIs due to the socio-economic differentiations found among the consumers, i.e., people's choices of consumption and their purchasing power. Though, in 2011 to 2012, the government announced a new set of consumer indices, i.e., CPIR, CPIU, and CPIC. Datasets for the older CPIs, to be phased out in coming times, are still announced by the Central Statistical Office, CSO. A brief review of the older CPIs are given below. 1. CPIIW, the Consumer Price Index for the Industrial Workers, CPIIW, has 260 items, plus the services, in its basket with 2001 as the base year. The first base year was 1958 to 59. The data is collected at 76 centers with 1 month's frequency, and the index has a time lag of 1 month. Basically, this index specifies the government employees, other than banks and embassies personnel. The wages or salaries of the central government employees are revised on the basis of the changes occurring in this index. The dearness allowance, DA, is announced twice a year. When the Pay Commission recommends pay revisions, the base is the CPI, IW. 2. CPI WNME, the Consumer Price Index for the urban non-manual employees, CPI WNME, has 1984 to 85. First base year was 1958 to 59 as the base year, and 146 to 365 commodities in the basket for which data is collected at 59 centers in the country. Data collection frequency is monthly, with 2 weeks time lag. This price index has limited use, and it is basically used for determining dearness allowances, DAS, of employees of some foreign companies operating in India, i.e., airlines, communications, banking, insurance, embassies, and other financial services. It is also used under the Income Tax Act to determine capital gains and by the CSO, Central Statistical Organization, for deflating selected services sectors' contribution to the GDP at factor cost and current prices to calculate the corresponding figure at constant prices. Since the publication of the CPI, U started the index was discontinued with from January 2011. 3. CPIL, the Consumer Price Index for Agricultural Laborers, CPIL, has 1986 to 87 as its base year with 260 commodities in its basket. The data is collected in 600 villages with a monthly frequency and has 3 weeks time lag. This index is used for revising minimum wages for agricultural laborers in different states. As the consumption pattern of agricultural laborers has changed since 1986 to 87, its base year, the Labour Bureau proposes to revise the existing base year of this index. For the revision, the consumer expenditure data collected by the NSSO during its 61st NSS round, 2004-05, is proposed to be used. The governments at the center and states remain vigilant regarding the changes in this index as it shows the price impact on the most vulnerable segment of the society. This segment spends almost 75% of its total income on the purchase of food articles. Governments' failure to stabilize the index in the long range can make them politically volatile and be translated into political debacles. That is why the FCI is always kept ready to supply cheaper food grains in the situations of any price rise. 4. CPIRL, there is yet another consumer price index for the rural laborers, CPIRL, with 1983 as the base year. Data is collected at 600 villages on monthly frequency with 3 weeks time lag. Its basket contains 260 commodities. The agricultural and rural laborers in India create an overlap, i.e., the same laborers work as the rural laborers once the farm sector has either low or no employment scope. Probably, due to this reason this index was dropped by the government in 2001-02. But after the government change at the center the index was revived again. Revision in the CPI. In 2011 to 2012, government announced a new set of the consumer price indices, CPIR for the rural market, CPIU for the urban market, and by combining them, a national CPI. The National Consumer Price Index is called CPIC, where C stands for combined. In order to make them more robust, the CPIs were further revised in 2015 by incorporating the following changes. 1. The base year has been changed from 2010 is equal to 100 to 2012 is equal to 100. 2. The basket of items and their weighing diagrams have been prepared using the Modified Mixed Reference Period, MMRP, data of Consumer Expenditure Survey, CES, 2011 to 12 of the 68th round of National Sample Survey, NSS. This has been done to make it consistent with the international practice of shorter reference period for most of the food items and longer reference period for the items of infrequent consumption. The weighing diagrams of old series of CPI were based on the Uniform Reference Period, URP, data of CES, 2004-05, of the 61st round of NSS. With this change in the weighing diagrams, the gap between weight reference year and price reference year, base year, which was 6 years in the old series, has now been reduced to 6 months only. Due to change in the consumption pattern from 2004-05 to 2011-12, the weighing diagrams, share of expenditure to total expenditure, have changed. A comparison of weighing diagrams of the old and revised series is given in Table 7.2. Table 7.2 Comparison of weighing diagrams of the existing and revised series of CPI. 3. The number of groups, which was 5 in the old series, has now been increased to 6. Pan, tobacco and intoxicants, which was a subgroup under the group food, beverages and tobacco, has now been made as a separate group. Accordingly, the group food, beverages and tobacco has been changed to food and beverages. 4. Egg, which was part of the subgroup egg, fish and meat in the old series, has now been made as a separate subgroup. Accordingly, the earlier subgroup has been modified as meat and fish. 5. The elementary or item indices are now being computed using geometric mean, GM, of the price relatives of current prices with respect to base prices of different markets in consonance with the international practice. In the old series, arithmetic mean, AM, was used for that purpose. The advantage of using GM is that it moderates the volatility of the indices as GM is less affected by extreme values. 6. Prices of PDS items under Antyodaya Anna Yojana (AY) have also been included for compilation of indices of PDS items, in addition to above poverty line (APL) and below poverty line (BPL) prices being taken in the old series. 7. Sample size for collection of house rent data for compilation of house rent index, which was 6,684 rented dwellings in the old series, has now been doubled to 13,368 rented dwellings in the revised series. 8. Apart from all India CPIs, rural, urban, combined, for subgroup, group and general index, all groups, which were released for the old series, all India item CPIs, combined, will also be available. 9. The consumer food price indices, rural, urban, combined, will be compiled as weighted average of the indices of following subgroups. As practiced earlier in the old series, only the weights have been revised. Trends in inflation. Inflation has been a highly sensitive issue in India right since independence, and it has been so during the ongoing reforms process period, too. It has an incessant tendency of resulting into double digits, taking politically explosive proportions like governments falling at the center and state levels due to price rise of the commodities such as edible oil, onion, potato, etc. In such situations, the government in general has been taking recourse to tighter money supply to contain the state-level disturbances due to price rise of the commodities such as edible oil, onion, potato, etc., although it has contained inflation, but at the cost of higher growth. Price rise got rooted in India's political psyche in such a way that the government did check frequent famines quickly at the cost of long-term endemic hunger and sustained malnutrition. Table 7.3 All India weights of different subgroups within Consumer Food Price Index. Decadal inflation in India looks comparatively normal with reference to many developing economies. But it has sporadic incidences of double-digit tendencies, mainly due to supply-side shortfalls caused by droughts, monsoon failures, price rise of crude oil in the international market or fund diversions due to wars, the Chinese War of 1962 and the Pakistan Wars of 1965–66 and 1971. The decadal inflation in India has been as given below. 1. During 1950s, remained at 1.7%. 2. During 1960s, remained at 6.4%. 3. During 1970s, remained at 9.0%. 4. During 1980s, remained at 8.0%. 5. During 1990s, remained at 9.5%. though it reached 0.5% by the fourth quarter of the fiscal 1998 to 99.6 during 2000. Inflation was at lower levels between 2008 from 3 to 5%. But from 2009 onwards it started moving upward with stubborn tendencies. Between 2009 to 13, the headline inflation remained stuck at uncomfortable levels, primarily due to food articles. Food inflation, led by protein-rich items, protein inflation, in the consequence of shift in dietary habit, income effect, via McGregor kind of schemes, increased wages, increase in prices of commodities in the global market, especially food articles, costlier fodder, costlier energy and fuel, etc. By late 2010, India had the phenomenon of skewflation, with inflation being in the range of 9 to 10%. 7. During 2010s, from 2010 to 11 to 2013 to 14, inflation remained higher. The average inflation at WPI and CPI was 8% and 9.7%, respectively. Food inflation, led by protein items, breached into double digit. Since mid-2014 inflation started moderating, WPI inflation remained in negative, minus 5.1% by August 2015, and CPI inflation positive of 4.9% in December 2016, showing a wedge of 10%. The wedge between WPI and CPIC started narrowing since January 2017, with WPI and CPIC both moderating to 2.3% and 2.5% respectively by 2018 to 2019. Current trends, as per the Economic Survey 2019 to 2020, the latest trends of inflation in the country are as given below. The headline inflation based on CPIC has been sliding since 2014, falling from 5.9% of 2014 to 2015 to 3.4% by 2018 to 2019. The fall was led by a drastic fall in food inflation, which fell down from 6.4% in 2014 to 2015 to 0.1% in 2018 to 2019. Since August 2019, a slight rise was seen in the CPIC and food inflation. By December 2019, CPIC was 7.4% and CPI food inflation 14.1%. This rise was mainly driven by the rise in vegetable prices. In December 2019, WPI stood at 2.6%, which had been declining from April 2019, 3.2%, to November 2019, 0.6%. WPI Food Index, which kept declining throughout 2017 to 2018 and 2018 to 2019, saw an uptick in 2019 to 2020. Since July 2018, CPI urban inflation has been consistently above CPI rural inflation. This is in contrast to earlier experience, where rural inflation has been mostly higher than urban inflation. The divergence has been mainly on account of the differential rates of food inflation between rural and urban areas witnessed during this period. In 2019 to 2020, there has been sudden change in the trend. Since July 2019, urban areas registered much higher food inflation when compared to rural areas. Divergence in rural-urban food inflation in 2019 to 2020 was mainly led by cereals, eggs, fruits, vegetables, etc. The slide in rural inflation could be because of fall in the growth of real rural wages. The divergence in rural-urban inflation is not just observed in the food component, but in other components also. 1. In clothing and footwear, inflation in urban areas was 3.3% in 2019 to 2020, April to December, approximately 3 percentage points higher than that observed in rural areas. 2. For pan, tobacco and intoxicants, fuel and light and miscellaneous groups, inflation observed in rural areas was higher than that in the urban areas. Miscellaneous basket comprises of household goods and services, health, transport and communication, recreation and amusement, education, personal care and effects. 3. However, due to the high overall weight attached to the food and clothing and footwear groups in the rural index, the overall inflation observed in rural areas at 3.4% was lower than the overall inflation observed in urban areas, which was at 5.0% in 2019 to 2020, April to December. 4. The decline in rural inflation in items like clothing and footwear, fuel and light could be due to fall in growth of real rural wages, while rise in rural price index for items like education, health, personal care, etc. also raises the question of affordability of these items to the rural segment. An analysis of inflationary trends in India does not pinpoint any one reason behind it. Rather, economists have cited all possible reasons, the so-called good and bad, for it. We may have a brief idea about them. 1. Structural inflation. With few exceptional years, India has been facing the typical problem of bottleneck inflation, i.e., structural inflation, which arises out of shortfalls in the supply of goods, a general crisis of a developing economy, rising demand, but lack of investable capital to produce the required level of goods. Whenever the government managed to go for higher growths by managing higher investable capital, it had inflationary pressures on the economy, seen during 1970s and 1980s especially, and growth was sacrificed at the altar of lower inflation, which was politically more justified. Thus, the supply-side mismatch remained a long-drawn problem in India for higher inflation. After some time, even if the government managed higher expenditure, most of it went to the non-developmental areas, which did show low growth with higher inflation, signs of a stagnating economy. 2. Cost-push inflation. Due to inflation tax, the price of goods and services in India have been rising as the government took alternative recourse to increase its revenue receipts. We see it taking place due to higher import duties on raw materials also. The non-value-added tax, non-VAT, structure of India in the past was also having cascading effect on the prices of commodities in the country. The government needed higher revenues to finance its planned development, thus the above given factors looked inescapable. 3. Fiscal policy. To finance the developmental requirements of the economy, the governments became trapped in the cyclical process of overmoney supply. At first it was done by external borrowings, but by the late 1960s onwards, once deficit financing got acceptance around the world, the government started taking recourse to heavy internal borrowings as well as printing of fresh currency too. A major part of the government's internal borrowing till 2005 to 2006 was contributed by the Reserve Bank of India, RBI, which leads to price rise. For any government deficit, if the central bank, RBI, is purchasing primary issues of the government's securities or creating fresh advances to the government, the combined effect has to be higher inflation, lower savings rates and lower economic growth, the vices of unsound fiscal policy. The higher fiscal deficit tends to bring about higher interest rates. As demand for funds rise, excess demand raises expected inflation and expected depreciation of the currency. Once the foreign exchange, Forex, reserves started increasing with a faster pace by the early 2001 fiscal, its cost of maintenance has been translated into higher prices as the RBI purchases the foreign currencies it supplies into equivalent rupees into the economy, which creates extra demand and the prices go up. The higher revenue deficits, driven by high interest payments, subsidies, salaries and pensions, basically, and fiscal deficits make the government supply more money which push the inflation in the upward direction. Once the Fiscal and Budget Management Act came into force in 2003, the scenario improved in the coming times. Though the period from 1999 to 2003 did show high growth with low inflation and the lowest interest rates in India. Healthy range of inflation. Higher inflation and higher growth as a trade-off was questioned in the late 1980s by the developed economies, as the economic and social costs of higher inflation also needed policy attention, a costly trade-off. In coming times, most of the world economies went in favor of a stable inflation, i.e., inflation targeting, though the idea has been protested. India also started inflation stabilization, informed targeting at WPI, by the early 1970s. It was in 1973 that inflation crossed the 20% mark on account of the international oil price rise, and the government, the Indira Gandhi government, devised a severe anti-inflation package which included directly restricting the disposable incomes of the people. This measure was used for the first time in India. The package had an impact, and by March 1975 the inflation calmed down to 5.7%. This was the time when the RBI was given a new function, inflation stabilization, and India entered the era of monetary controls for inflation. With inflation targeting, there started a debate concerning the healthy range of inflation for the Indian economy, i.e., by mid-1970s. We may have some official and non-official versions of the suitable range of inflation pointed out from time to time. 1. The Chakravarti Committee, 1985, treated 4% inflation as acceptable for the economy in its report on the monetary system. He also added that this level of price rise will facilitate the purpose of attracting investment for the desired level of growth. 2. The Government of India accepted a range of 4 to 6% inflation as acceptable for the economy, citing the world average of 0 to 3% at the time, 1997 to 98. 3. The RBI Governor C. Rangarajan advocated that inflation rate must come down initially to 6 to 7% and eventually to 5 to 6% on an average over the years. 4. The Tarapur Committee on Capital Account Convertibility recommended an acceptable range of 3 to 5% inflation for the 3-year period, 1997 to 98 to 1999 to 2000. In the recent times, June 2003 onwards, the government or the RBI has maintained a general policy of keeping inflation below 5% mark at any cost, as if fixing 4 to 5% as the healthy range of inflation for the economy. The medium-term objective, i.e., target, of the government is to keep inflation in the 4.5% range. One thing should be kept in mind, that inflation has always been a political matter in the country. Every time the RBI tried to check the rising inflation via monetary measures, a majority of experts objected to it by calling it a move to sacrifice growth for lower price levels. A tighter monetary policy decelerates investment and growth, hampers the growth prospects of the middle class in general and the entrepreneurs in particular, while the wage earners as well as the poor segment of society feels relieved, at least in short term. In February 2015, India formally commenced the process of inflation targeting. Now, the new monthly CPI-C is taken as the measure of headline inflation and is tracked by the RBI to anchor its monetary policy, and the healthy annual range for it is between 2 to 6%. Producer Price Index. Producer Price Index, PPI, is a better measure of inflation in comparison to both WPI and CPI. The ongoing process of economic reforms has increasingly connected India to the world, which makes it necessary to evolve right comparative indicators. Inflation being among the most vital economic indicator in comparative economics, the government proposed to switch over from the WPI to PPI in 2003 to 2004. Special features: the PPI measures price changes from the perspective of the producer, while CPI from the perspective of consumer and WPI from the perspective of wholesale mandis. In practice, the wholesalers charge higher prices to retailers, in turn retailers charge higher prices to consumers, and the price increase is translated into the higher consumer prices. Thus, the PPI is useful in having an idea of the consumer prices in the future. In PPI, only basic prices are used while taxes, trade margins, and transport costs are excluded. This index is considered a better measure of inflation as price changes at primary and intermediate stages can be tracked before it gets built into the finished goods stage. Due to its better use, many economies have switched over to the PPI. The oldest such series is maintained by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, for the US economy. The index is capable of measuring prices at the wholesaler or the producer stage, widely used by private business houses in their price targeting. By mid-2019, government did set up a working group headed by Ramesh Chand, member Niti Aayog, with a wide term of reference which includes the following issues related to the existing WPI. 1. Suggesting a new base year of WPI. The last revision in its base year to 2011 to 2012 was done in May 2017. 2. Reviewing the commodity basket of the WPI and decide on the computational methodology to be adopted for monthly WPI or PPI. Since 2011 to 2012, significant structural changes have taken place in the economy, and it has become necessary to examine the coverage of commodities, weighting diagram, and related issues pertaining to the existing WPI. 3. Reviewing the existing system of price collection in particular for manufacturing sector and suggest changes for improvement. Data collection method for manufacturing sector has been weak and unable to capture the sector in the real sense. And 4. Devising a new PPI and recommend a roadmap to switch over from WPI to PPI. It has been a long-drawn plan of the governments to switch over from WPI to PPI. The first working group on it was set up in 2004 to 2005 under the chairmanship of Professor Abhijit Sen, member of the erstwhile Planning Commission, which got inputs from the IMF also. In 2014, another working group was set up under Professor B. N. Goldar to devise a PPI after the Reserve Bank of India began considering CPIC inflation as a better gauge over the WPI inflation. Housing Price Index. India's official Housing Price Index, HPI, was launched in July 2007 in Mumbai. Basically developed by the Indian Home Loans Regulator, the National Housing Bank, NHB, the index is named NHB Residex. Currently, it is published for 50 cities, being expanded to cover 100 cities on quarterly basis with 2012 to 13 as base year. Among 50 cities covered are 18 state or UT capitals and 37 smart cities. NHB is not computing the composite All India Housing Price Index as of now. Meanwhile, the RBI, Reserve Bank of India, began compiling a House Price Index, HPI, in 2007 with a quarterly HPI for Mumbai city, base 2002-03 is equal to 100. Since then, it has extended its coverage to 9 more cities, revised its base to 2010 to 11 and started publishing a composite All India HPI. RBI's quarterly HPI is based on transactions data received from housing registration authorities in 10 major cities. With an overall objective of bringing transparency in the Indian real estate market, the index is expected to serve some highly important and timely purposes. 1. Whether a broker is quoting too high a price for houses in the cities. 2. Banks or housing finance bodies will be able to estimate only if the loan applications are realistic for the properties. 3. This will also show the level of non-performing assets in the housing sector. 4. And most importantly, it will serve as a realistic price index for the buyers. At present, a buyer had no means to judge whether a rise in property price was in the offing with the general level of inflation, i.e., at CPIC, in the country, or has been scaled up disproportionately. Other than quotes from brokers, there are no means at present to evaluate the changes in price in this sector. At present, the only index that gave some idea of housing price changes was the CPI, IW, which being a national index did not show regional variations. Service Price Index. The contribution of the tertiary sector in India's GDP has been strengthening for the past 10 years, and today it stands above 60%. The need for a Service Price Index, SPI, in India is warranted by the growing dominance of the sector in the economy. There is no index, so far, to measure the price changes in the services sector. The present inflation, at the WPI, only shows the price movements of the commodity-producing sector, i.e., it includes only the primary and the secondary sectors. The tertiary sector is not represented by it. The need for such an index was recommended by the working group, under the chairmanship of Professor Abhijit Sen, member, Planning Commission, set up to revise the WPI 1993-94 series, which was reiterated by the National Statistical Commission, headed by C. Rangarajan. The Office of the Economic Advisor, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, has been making an effort to develop sector-specific service price index for the country, with the technical assistance being received under the World Bank Assisted Economic Reforms Projects, WBARPs. Starting in 2005 to 2006, the office has put in place experimental service price index for a total of 7 services: railways, postal, air, telecom, port, banking and insurance services. Evolving a single and national service price index is still in the process. Section B. Business Cycle. Introduction. The discussion on growth and development has shown their internal interdependence. If the quality of life in an economy is to be enhanced, there is a need of conscious public policy which can spend and invest in areas like food, nutrition, health, education, shelter, social security, etc. But for such expenditures and investments, the economy needs equitable level of income too. The income enhancement in any economy takes place via increasing the level of production in the economy, i.e., Real Gross National Product, GNP. It means development requires higher growth, i.e., higher levels of economic activities. With the help of suitable kind of economic policies, the government of an economy keeps trying to maintain a higher level of economic activity. But, at times, economy keeps failing in this objective. And, thus economies fluctuate between the best and the worst levels of economic activities, which is known in economics as boom and depression, respectively. They can be called different phases of the economic activities of the economies. In between boom and depression, there might be many other situations of the economic activities, such as stagnation, slowdown, recession, and recovery. The fluctuations in the level of economic activity between the depressions and booms has been called by the economists as business cycle or trade cycle, with recession and recovery as the main intermediate stages. Stagnation and slowdown may be considered as other intermediate stages of the business cycle. We intend here to understand the actual meanings of each of the stages. Economists have pointed out that the business cycle is characterized by 4 phases or stages in which economies alternate: 1. Depression, 2. Recovery, 3. Boom, 4. Recession. Depression. Though depression has visited the world economy only once in 1929, economists have pinpointed enough number of traits to recognize it. The major traits of depression could be as given below. 1. An extremely low aggregate demand in the economy causes activities to decelerate. 2. The inflation being comparatively lower. 3. The employment avenues start shrinking, forcing unemployment rate to grow fast. 4. To keep the business going, production houses go for forced labor cuts or retrenchment to cut down production cost and be competitive in the market, etc. The economic situations become so chaotic in the phase of depression that governments have almost no control over the economy. The Great Depression of 1929 gave rise to the ideas of strong government intervention in the economy, such as deficit financing, monetary management, etc. What the governments may do if depression visits the economy? The simple answer the world has been able to find is to repeat the policy measures of 1929. The best way to avoid depression is not to let it visit. This is why every modern economy keeps extra vigil on the major symptoms of its economy so that the prevention measures can be taken in time and depression is avoided. Recovery. An economy tries to come out of the low production phase to survive. The low production phase might be depression, recession or slowdown, with the former being the worst and rare. Governments take many new fiscal and monetary measures to boost demand and production, and ultimately a recovery in an economy is managed. The business cycle of recovery may show the following major economy traits. 1. An upturn in aggregate, total demand, which has to be accompanied by increase in the level of production. 2. Production process expands and new investments become attractive. 3. As demand goes upward, inflation also moves upward, making borrowing cheaper for investors. 4. With an upturn in production, new employment avenues are created and unemployment rate starts declining, etc. With the above symptoms, people's income go for a certain increase, which creates new demand, and a cycle of demand and production, supply, starts playing hand in hand to recover the economy. To recover an economy, governments usually go for tax breaks, interest cuts, an increase in salaries of its employees, etc. Assimilation of innovations by the entrepreneurs and search for new frontiers of enterprise do play a very vital role in the process of recovery, provided these activities are at first incentives by the governments. The Euro-American economies recovered out of the Great Depression with the help of the measures cited above. Such recoveries have been seen many times around the world when economies recovered from slowdown or the recessionary phases. The best example of recent times could be cited from India of 1997 to 2002, when the economy suffered severe bouts of slowdown and recession. Boom. A strong upward fluctuation in the economic activities is called boom. As economies try to recover out of the phases of slowdown, recession and depression, at times the measures taken by the governments as well as the private sector might put economic activities as such which the economic systems fail to digest. This is the phase of the boom. The major economic traits of boom may be listed as given below. 1. An accelerated and prolonged increase in the demand. 2. Demand peaks up to such a high level that it exceeds sustainable output or production levels. 3. The economy heats up and a demand-supply lag is visible. 4. The market forces mismatch, i.e., demand and supply disequilibrium, and tend to create a situation where inflation starts going upward. 5. The economy might face structural problems like shortage of investable capital, lower savings, falling standard of living, creation of a seller's market. The phase of recovery is considered good for the economy, and it reaches the stage of boom, which is considered better. But the boom has its negative side also. Boom is usually followed by price rise. As a boom is a strong upward fluctuation in an economy, the supply-side pattern of the economy starts lagging behind the pace of the accelerated aggregate demand. But the dilemma of recovery puts every economy on the path to boom. This has been the experience in the developed world during the 1990s, especially in the US economy. The same scenario developed in India after the economy recovered from the recessionary period of 1996 to 97 by the year 2002-03, when the rate of inflation peaked to almost 8% for a few months. Majority of the experts felt that Indian economy at that time was passing through a phase of boom, and we have seen how the government has been facing difficulty in containing inflation around the 5% mark. Even the government accepted that the economy was overheating by mid-2007. The symptoms of overheating are as follows. 1. There is a downturn in the aggregate demand on overall fall in the demand. 2. As demand falls, the level of production output in the economy also falls. 3. As producers cut down their production levels, new employment opportunities are not created, thus employment growth rate falls. 4. As demand keeps on falling, usually producers start cutting down their labor force to adjust their overhead expenditure and the cost of production, labor cut is not forced here but voluntary, resulting in increase in the unemployment rate. 5. If the government fails to rescue the economy from the phase of recession, the dangerous stage of depression remains the logical follow-up. 6. The rate of inflation always remains at lower levels, discouraging new investments and lending. Recession. This is somewhat similar to the phase of depression. We may call it a mild form of depression, fatal for economies, as this may lead to depression if not handled with care and in time. The financial crisis, which followed the US subprime crisis in almost the whole Euro-American economies, has basically brought in severe recessionary trends there. Major traits of recession, to a great extent, are similar to that of depression, except the point 4 of the depression, discussed earlier, may be summed up as follows. 1. There is a general fall in demand as economic activities takes a downturn. 2. Inflation remains lower and shows further signs of falling down. 3. Employment rate falls or unemployment rate grows. 4. Industries resort to price cuts to sustain their business. In the financial year 1996 to 97, the Indian economy was taken up by the cycle of recession, basically due to a general downturn in domestic as well as foreign demands, initiated by the Southeast Asian currency crisis of mid-1990s. The whole plan of economic reforms in India was derailed, and it was only by the end of 2001-02 that the economy was able to recover. What may a government do to rescue the economy from the phase of recession? The usual remedies are given below. 1. Direct and indirect taxes should be cut down so that the consumers have higher disposable incomes, income after paying direct tax, i.e., income tax, on the one hand, and the goods should become cheaper on the other hand. Thus there is hope that the demand might pick up. 2. The burden of direct taxes, especially the income tax, dividend tax, interest tax, are slashed to enhance the disposable income, i.e., income after direct tax payment. 3. Salaries and wages should be revised by the government to encourage general spending by the consumers, as the Government of India implemented the recommendations of the Fifth Pay Commission without much deliberation in 1996 to 97. 4. Indirect taxes such as custom duty, excise duty, SENVAT, sales tax, etc., should be cut down so that produced goods reach the market at cheaper prices. 5. The government usually goes on to follow a cheap money supply policy by slashing down interest rates across the board, and the lending procedure is also liberalized. 6. Tax breaks are announced for new investments in the productive areas, etc. All the above given measures were taken up by the United Front government in 1996 to 97 to pull the economy out of the menace of the recession. The forthcoming government took several other such measures by the end of 1998 to 99 onwards, the NDA government. Ultimately, the measures taken up by the governments accompanied by a general recovery in the world economy. The Indian economy started recovering from the bout of recession. Many experts had already predicted a possibility of depression with a 0% rate of inflation. Although this did not happen, the World Bank and IMF defined recession technically also. Any economy seeing fall in its GDP for 2 consecutive quarters is said to be hit with technical recession. Though, to declare global recession, the agencies go into data related to employment, demand of oil, etc. It is defined with the help of global economic growth rate also. Global growth rate falling below 2.5% is considered technical recession. 2.5% is the threshold growth rate for technical global recession. Growth recession. An expression coined by economists to describe an economy that is growing at such a slow pace that more jobs are being lost than are being added. The lack of job creation makes it feel as if the economy is in a recession, even though the economy is still advancing. Many economists believe that between 2002 and 2003, the United States economy was in a phase of growth recession. In fact, at several points over the past 25 years, the US economy is said to have experienced a growth recession. That is, in spite of gains in real GDP, job growth was either non-existent or was being destroyed at a faster rate than new jobs were being added. Experts have revived this term in the wake of the ongoing financial crisis in the Euro-American economies since 2008. The situation is better described by the term double-dip recession. Double-dip recession. The concept of recession in the USA and Eurozone is quite precise and technical. 2 consecutive quarters of falling GDP is how it is defined in these economies. And the idea of the double-dip recession is an extension of it. A double-dip recession refers to a recession followed by a short-lived recovery, followed by another recession, the GDP growth sliding back to negative after a quarter or 2 of positive growth. The causes for such a recession vary, but often include a slowdown in the demand for goods and services because of layoffs, forced job cuts, and spending cutbacks done in the previous downturn. A double dip, which may be even triple dip, is a worst-case scenario. Fear or speculation of it moves the economy into a deeper and longer recession, and recovery becomes too difficult. As the world saw in the case of the Eurozone crisis, there was a fear of such a recession by first quarter of 2013. Conclusion. Business cycles are basically fluctuations in the production levels of economies above and below the trend of the equilibrium levels. But why do economies fluctuate? There are many factors which are said to be responsible for it. As per the experts, 1. Economic instability and uncertainty. due to logical or illogical expectations, may discourage investments, thereby reducing growth in the long term. 2. A lack of the creative destruction, i.e., innovation, may put the economy in a slump or slow down in its overall production. 3. Anti-inflationary government policies, especially when general elections are nearing, may direct the attraction of investors in the economy. 4. Unforeseen disasters may cause economies to fluctuate.